Welcome to Implied with Zein, where conversations about value, strategy, and market signals are unpacked for the GCC markets, with insights that travel far wider.
You know what I think is probably the most underestimated challenge in emerging markets? Companies and investors often speak different languages. On one side, investors ask how value is created and sustained, and on the other, companies answer, here's how we make profit. Investors ask, how do you decide where to deploy capital? Companies answer, we increased capex by 15% this year. Not necessarily because investors are unnecessarily pushy or because companies lack competence, but because there isn't always a common understanding, a common language. I've seen it happen. I've seen it happen many times, and the cost of that gap shows up in mispriced companies, in frustrated executives and board of directors, in investors who quite honestly disengage when they sense that the conversation isn't grounded in market logic. My name is Zein, and this is Implied. Implied is a space where I openly discuss the conversations between companies and investors. The focus is on GCC markets, but the insights are universal. I've spent nearly 18 years now on different sides of the capital markets table. First in investment research, analyzing fundamentals, asking questions, testing assumptions, basically valuing companies and producing investment recommendations. I covered different companies and sectors in the MENA region, and eventually I crossed over into investor relations. And suddenly it was my turn to answer the questions. First at Saudi Aramco, where I led the analyst engagement team, then at Salik, Dubai's toll road operator, where I headed investor relations through the IPO and beyond. By now, I've sat in probably thousands of hours in investor meetings, so I've watched these conversations play out from both sides of the table, as an observer, as the one asking questions, and as the one answering them. After leaving Salik, I took a year off and then started Minalytica, which on paper is an investor relations and strategic capital planning advisory firm based in Dubai. But in practice, it's my attempt at doing advisory differently. Not in terms of routine compliance and nicely written speeches and scripts, but as something a lot closer to how investors think and make decisions. It's simply about helping companies think about value creation. What drives it, what weakens it, how capital is deployed, and if the strategy translates into sustainable excess returns. So why am I starting this podcast? By now you're probably wondering. And let me be very honest. Many companies in the region are still building the foundations to fully understand their intrinsic value. Some are still developing their long-term strategy. Some don't connect profit-making to value creation in quite the way investors do. Some haven't systematically mapped their value drivers yet. And some don't maintain investor-grade financial models. And without some of those foundations, the discipline of investor relations often defaults to box ticking and generic disclosures. And let me say this out loud. It defaults to corporate speak as well. And by that, I mean the kind of messaging where companies say what they want to say, not necessarily what investors actually need to hear. We tend to call it transparency. And many companies genuinely aim to be transparent, but the real challenge isn't transparency itself. It's what we actually mean by transparency. Whether, what's shared publicly actually reconciles with how investors think and make decisions. That gap is what I mean by implied. And this podcast is about exploring that gap. And I'm starting this now because the timing matters, in my opinion. The GCC markets are busier than ever. More IPOs, more investors, more attention, but also more competition for that attention and that capital. So if there was ever a time for us to revisit the fundamentals of value creation and what drives prices, it's probably now. And honestly, I haven't seen anyone else connect these different threads in quite the way I want to. Now, who is this podcast for? Well, the reality is that the topics I want to explore cut across the whole ecosystem. Investors, analysts, boards, management teams, advisors, bankers, entrepreneurs, founders, regulators. Because in the real world, these different groups don't operate in isolation, of course. They influence each other, and let's be honest, they also frustrate each other. And this isn't just for public companies, by the way, because private companies can benefit from thinking about value creation and expectations management with quite the same discipline. In fact, I would argue that private companies might benefit even more, simply because they're not necessarily conditioned to the constant pressure of public market regulations and daily investor scrutiny. And by the way, most intrinsic investors know much of what I want to talk about. And my hope is that this platform acts like a mirror for investors to reflect these ideas. And I'd love for them to engage and add their voice. The same absolutely goes for companies. I want to hear how they think about value creation, where they struggle, and how they see the gap with investors. But Either way, I'll do my best to keep it relevant to everyone in the room. This brings me to something important, what this podcast is and what it isn't. I'm unfortunately not here to talk about stock picks in the GCC or explain if any specific company is worth investing in or discuss internal governance and compliance manuals. And I don't plan to walk you through financial calendars or quarterly reporting routines. This podcast is not about logistics or process. What I will do, though, is talk about how economic value is actually created and destroyed. We'll get into capital allocation decisions. We'll get into competitive strategy. We'll discuss information economics and signaling. We'll talk about how investors try to gain information advantage ethically. We will explore how expectations are set and managed. And we will discuss the power of narrative in markets and the real purpose of firms. And I will approach this with curiosity and humility because this podcast is a relaxed space, as you can see. No suits, no ties. And I'm not promising all the answers because I'm not an expert in everything. Nobody is. But if you leave each episode with a new idea or even just better questions, then the podcast is doing exactly what it's meant to. So let's talk some logistics. The first set of episodes, let's call them season 1, will start light, short, and to the point, less than 10 minutes each. And once the foundation is set, the plan is to move into deeper dives. And every now and then, I may bring in a guest who will add their own perspective. For now, I'm recording in English for inclusivity and because it's how most investor conversations happen across the GCC. But if enough people want it in Arabic, maybe we go there too. Now, new episodes will be released every Monday morning, and you'll find us on YouTube, LinkedIn, and Instagram, and a few other platforms in due course. I'm not really one to push for subscriptions. My goal here isn't reach or clicks or anything like that. It's a niche subject anyway. But honestly, it's the only way I'll know I'm connecting with the people who think the way I do. And before I wrap up, let me just give you a quick disclaimer. This podcast is purely for informational and educational purposes. If I mention a company, that's not advertising, it's not endorsement or recommendation. The views expressed on here are mine alone and not those of any client or employer, whether past, current, or future. And of course, nothing on this podcast is investment, legal, or financial advice. Next week, we'll talk about the universal drivers of value. I am Zein, and this is Implied. Thanks for listening.
You've been listening to Implied. If you found this useful, follow the show and share it with a colleague or friend. It helps more people discover the conversations. For episode alerts and show notes, subscribe at impliedpodcast.com. And if you have thoughts, questions, or even pushback, we'd love to hear from you. Remember, nothing here is an endorsement or investment advice. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.